Welcome to Herbonomics on Cannabis Tech. I'm your host, Christina Eder, and with me is my co-host, Tony Solano from Hemp Manufacturing. Welcome back, Tony.
Hi! So good to be back.
In this second episode of our new podcast, Herbonomics, we are going to look at the cannabis and hemp industries by the numbers. We've invited a special guest, Beau Whitney, who is an economist and creator of the Economics of Cannabis with Whitney Economics, and the namesake of our new podcast, Herbonomics. Mr. Whitney is currently the chief economist for the National Industrial Hemp Council and the National Cannabis Industry Association. A member of the American Economic Association, the Oregon chapter president of the National Association of Business Economics, and a participant in the meetings of the Oregon Council and Economic Advisors, he is widely regarded as one of the country's leading cannabis economists. Welcome to the show, Mr. Whitney. Thank you so much for your time today and joining us and collaborating on this show with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Mr. Whitney, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how Whitney Economics came to be?
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting story. I was teaching economics at the university level, and a student started asking me questions about how to set up businesses, business structures, taxes, this and that and the other thing. And I asked him what industry he was in, and he said, I'm in the cannabis industry. I said, how large is that market? And he said, I don't know, you're the economist, you tell me. And so I thought that was actually quite brilliant. And as a result, I started looking into it. Oregon was just at the beginning of the adult use legalization referendum, Measure 91. And so I started looking into the market and consulting with some folks out of Colorado, and I realized that the Oregon market was huge. And so I set up my own consulting company, Whitney Economics. And I thought I would just jump in and really delve into the market by the numbers. And at that time, there wasn't a whole lot of numbers to be had. Nobody knew sales, demand, participation, or anything of that nature. And so I built a market model, looked at Oregon, and then realizing the potential, I built a larger market model to include the U.S., and so that was kind of the beginning. And then I got picked up by a company. I published my market model as public testimony in the run-up to Measure 91 and got a lot of notoriety as a result of it, because the advocate for the bill was on one side, the very conservative Legislative Revenue Office was on the other in terms of forecasts, and mine was almost exactly in the middle. So people started asking me more about the market, and then that's when I started digging in more detail. And from there, I jumped in and was recruited by a company that wanted to take their medical business into the adult use space and then eventually public. And so I became the chief operations officer of a company, and we eventually scaled them up from say $100,000 a month in revenue to $2 million a month in revenue, using my background in supply chain management from Intel and from the high tech industry. So I brought that skill set to the market, and then scaled them up, and then eventually took them public. Now, the company I took public was the first company with U.S. operations to go public on the Canadian Securities Exchange. So that in itself was notable. And then at one point, though, I realized that my analytics and economics was more valuable than my role at this company that was now publicly traded. So I went off back on my own and started becoming the economic analyst that you see before you today.
Now, one of the things I wanted to touch on was that outside of Whitney Economics, clearly your experience with Whitney Economics kind of led you into some of these roles, but you work with multiple professional cannabis organizations. Can you talk a little bit about what your role does with those different organizations?
Yeah, a lot of times there are narratives that are out there that get picked up by policymakers, by regulators, by operators, but there's not a whole lot of data to back up those narratives. And that's kind of systemic the way it is right now at the federal level. And so I've filled that niche in order to provide the data to support the narrative. Now, I don't bias my data. I just provide the data because the data really speaks for itself. It's very compelling both on the industrial side of cannabis and on the adult use and medical side of cannabis. And so my role on those organizations is mainly as an educator and a data provider. And I think it's a natural fit for me, and I really appreciate the support that these national organizations have given me as well.
Mr. Whitney, I have a question for you. How do you best define the term Herbonomics?
Well, Herbonomics, I came up with that because it was talking, I thought it was a play on words, right? So there's the herb and then economics. And I thought since my specialty has become cannabis, then it was just a natural fit to combine cannabis and economics in the form of Herbonomics.
Yeah, no, it's such a great name. We love it, and we're so appreciative of you lending it to us for this podcast. Now, one of the things that I really wanted to dive into, because this is recent news, this is something that I just received in my inbox a couple of days ago, and this latest report that you have on the U.S. Cannabis Business Conditions survey that you sent out. I would love to have you talk about that report a little bit. Tell us what that survey was like, who did it go out to, and how do you gauge the response that you got from that survey?
Yeah, thanks. The genesis of the survey was the fact that there's been a lot of discussion at the federal level of policies for widespread legalization, either comprehensive reform or incremental reform. Say, for example, the CAOA, also known as the Schumer-Booker-Wyden bill, or the Joyce bill, or the MORE Act. Or the Mace bill in the House of Representatives. A lot of this has to do with cannabis reform. Now, there's been a lot of discussion at the federal and a policy level, but I wanted to see if there was mismatches between the actual policy that was being proposed and what the actual requirements of the industry were. And when I put this out, I sent it out to as many of the 35,000 businesses in the cannabis space that are licensed by the regulators, sent it out to as many of them as I could. And when I tallied up the results, there were these massive disconnects between what was going on at the policy level, what was going on within the narrative from those policymakers, and then what was actually going on in the industry.
Interesting. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. And I think we hear that a lot, that there's definitely that disconnect there. And we're hearing so much more about these bills right now. I feel like it's in the news a lot. We've seen Schumer, recently has asked for any input as they're finalizing these new bills. So it's definitely going to be interesting, I think, to see what kind of happens here over the course of the next year. One of the things that was interesting to me in the report, and clearly this is something that we've been talking about since the cannabis industry began, is banking. And there's so much concern around the banking, and promise of banking legislation has kind of been dangling there for quite a while. Do you see an end to this banking dilemma? And if you do, when and how is it coming?
Yeah, well, I want to back up just a little bit, because the intention of the survey itself was to look at what is going on in the industry from their perspective, whether or not they're making a profit, whether or not they have key issues. But I also wanted to give them a forum to celebrate their successes. And so one of the questions was, what are some of your successes? Now, it was not surprising that the respondents tended to focus on the negative part of the industry, regulation, banking, taxes, etc. But I wanted to see from an operator's perspective what they're seeing, from a regulator perspective what they are seeing. We got some regulators to either support the survey or take it themselves. And then I also wanted to see what the policymakers had to say. Now, with respect to banking specifically, 72% of the respondents said that banking was their top concern. And this, of course, matches the narrative coming from the industry, but it provided for the first time data to the policymakers that said, yes, this is a top concern and it needs to be addressed from the industry perspective. A lot of it wasn't necessarily associated with just banking in the form of checking and savings, but it was also from the perspective of getting financial services, such as credit card processing, such as bridge loans, construction loans, even insurance. And taken from that perspective, it was overwhelming in terms of the response that this was a major, major issue that needed to be fixed very, very quickly.
Something that I noticed in the report, Mr. Whitney, you cited that 42% of cannabis businesses are turning a profit. What are some of the other key data points that are uncovered in the survey?
Well, what I found interesting about that statistic, 42% are making a profit, that means 58% are not. And either they're breaking even or they're not profitable at all. They're losing money. And I think a lot of the narrative these days coming from policymakers, both at the state level and the federal level, is that everybody's flush with cash. You can tax them as much as you want. You can put all of these requirements that no other industry has on them, increasing compliance costs, et cetera, and they can afford it. Well, clearly, when fewer people are making money than are not, then they can't really afford that to carry that economic burden with their businesses. Now, when I delved into that even deeper, now this went out, questions were associated with demographics as well, female respondents, white versus other BIPOC community members. And so when I peeled this back even farther, women were less likely to make a profit relative to that 42%. In fact, 63% of women-owned businesses or women respondents were not making a profit. And then when I looked at white versus non-white businesses, 68% of non-white businesses were not making a profit. And so this shows and supports the narrative that the lack of banking and financial services are disproportionately impacting women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses. And so having this data set available to provide to the policymakers is hugely, hugely valuable. And it's super important so that there's really no question about where the issues are and how important they are, especially to on the issue of inclusion and social equity and social justice.
What about the world of hemp? That covers a lot of particular data sets around the world of cannabis. But when we look at hemp in the U.S. market in terms of manufacturing, where's the impact, where's the opportunity, and where's the value proposition in the United States right now?
Yeah, hemp is a very, very interesting market in of itself. The hemp right now was legalized with the 2018 Farm Bill, and a whole bunch of people jumped into the market, and they had seen the prices for CBD and other cannabinoids, and the prices at that time were very, very high. And so a lot of people assume that if you just plant this, then you're going to just get rich after one season. Well, because so many people jumped in, they flooded the market with supply. There wasn't a whole lot of demand to satisfy that supply, and so prices crashed. And so the market today is much different than the market was before the 2018 Farm Bill. Now, I looked into this over the last couple of years by deploying a series of surveys to not only cultivators, but processors and product manufacturers. And the one area that's not really recognized is the area of product manufacturing. And so whereas cultivators may have had a processor to provide processing services to the processors didn't have customers in the form of product manufacturers to get those products into a form that could be sold to the retail consumer. And so there's a big gap in the value chain right now called product manufacturing. So just think of hemp manufacturing. Think of plastic manufacturers of hemp. Think of automotive or textiles. Think of, on the grain side, those that can provide products into the human food chain or the animal food chain. Those are the product manufacturers, and those are what is desperately needed right now in the hemp space. Unfortunately, because CBD dominates the headlines so much, and people see the crash in prices and all this other stuff, there's less of an incentive for investors or policymakers to make any changes to the environment to support the growth and development of the value chain associated with fiber and grain. Right now, the policymakers, unfortunately, are trying to control the cannabinoid market, and so they're suppressing the market rather than nurturing it where the real action is, and that being on fiber and grain.
Right. It's so interesting to see how this industry develops and how much more, infrastructure and like you said, things that we need for the industrial side of hemp to really kind of take off. And I agree. I think that CBD is kind of stealing that limelight. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to start this podcast, was to kind of give hemp and that industrial side of the industry a better opportunity really to shine in other areas other than just extraction and cannabinoid products that are available on the market right now. Now, one of the side effects of this growing industry, or one of the impacts, I guess, on economics from the cannabis and hemp industry, is the number of jobs that these industries are creating. I just read a headline here, I think it was last week that it came out, that talked about in 2021, 1 in 10 jobs in Missouri came from the medical cannabis industry. And that's just absolutely mind-boggling to me, considering, where we were 5, 6, 10 years ago. Can you give us kind of an update on where cannabis jobs are right now, and how are they impacted by the pandemic, if at all? And what are your predictions then for the future of cannabis job growth?
Yeah, so I've been looking at jobs and employment since 2014, since I first got into this. And for the last 3 years now, I've been teaming up with Leafly in order to produce a jobs report. They've been doing it for a couple of years prior to that, but since 2019, we've been working together. What we've seen is that as the adult use and medical programs are deployed throughout the United States, and this is growing in number, then there's an increase in demand for labor. And that demand at the beginning of 2021 was, for legal workers, was 321,000 workers. Now, this is more than cosmetic folks, beauticians, all this stuff. And by the end of 2021, we've seen significant growth in those employment numbers. I can't divulge yet. We're kind of in a quiet period with Leafly right now, but the numbers are growing exponentially, and they're projected to continue to grow throughout the remainder of this decade. And now I said decade, I'm not saying a couple of years. It's going to continue to grow throughout the decade. Now, my firm tracks the illicit to legal consumer conversions. And so we've developed models on how to predict the legal growth of retail in the cannabis sector. And so right now we're projecting roughly $29 billion worth of sales in 2022, growing to roughly $45 billion in sales by 2025. Now, even at $45 billion, that's not even half of the total addressable market in the United States. Now, when you go from 25 billion this last year to 29 billion to 45 billion, you're going to need more and more workers in order to support that legal demand. And so that's where the growth is. And this is a faster growing market in terms of legal employment than really any other sector in the U.S. economy. So there's huge potential, and I think that's the allure of some of these state policymakers that are promoting the transition from medical to adult use, or from legalizing into the medical and adult use space. They're seeing the job creation, the business creation, and the economic potential of cannabis. And that's just adult use and medical, doesn't even include hemp. And so they're seeing this, and so they're really interested in how do they get that, capture that market and realize that economic growth.
And you mentioned hemp. Is there any information that you have put together so far in regards to the hemp side of the equation? And do you forecast that because of growing demand in CBD and industrial hemp, that there's going to be an opportunity to help bolster American manufacturing?
Yes. 2 years ago, I worked with Clarissa Cooper, who joined my team for the season to put out a job report in the hemp industry. And at that time, 2 years ago, it was 125,000 workers. Now, I didn't refresh that data last year, and I have an ongoing survey right now in the hemp space to examine this very issue. And so by the time that NOCO comes around in March, I will have published that data from the survey. The survey right now is just open, and so I have preliminary data, but I haven't necessarily finalized the numbers on jobs and wages, because there's a lot of wages associated with it. When I did a quick scan earlier this morning, the wages were above market, and so it wasn't minimum wage workers. There were some really, really good jobs out there in the hemp space, and if you think about that, it's manufacturing, it's processing, and a lot of these require skills and have strong demand for wages. So, hemp operators are willing to pay those wages. So there's great economic potential just in the hemp side of the cannabis equation alone.
What else do you think needs to happen to support further production of hemp-based goods here in the United States?
Well, on the hemp side, one, I think that we need to decouple hemp for cannabinoid purposes with hemp for fiber purposes and hemp for grain. And so my firm, Whitney Economics, along with others, are producing reports that examine the fiber market and examine the cosmetic market, or examine the animal or the grain market, propagation market. And so in that sense, really what needs to be done is, after that's decoupled, then regulators need to understand that this is a growth environment, and they need supportive policy rather than controlling policy. And by enabling the and supporting the fiber and grain side of the hemp industry, you'll deploy so much social benefit, environmental benefit, in addition to the economic benefit. So in that sense, a conversion to green technology, for example, you can support that with hemp. Now, it's not the end-all be-all. It's not the solution for everything, but there are certain markets where hemp is a really good fit to support not previous policy, but future policies that are associated with the environment and sustainability.
You just kind of said the magic key word there. That's a great segue into my next question, and that's really what's on the horizon for Whitney Economics, and where do you kind of see the future here in this next couple of years for cannabis and hemp, with all of this stuff that's happening right now, with the jobs increase, with legislation on the horizon? Just what's in your crystal ball?
Well, on the adult use and medical side of things, I see incremental form taking shape more so than comprehensive reform. There's just not the appetite nor the willingness to communicate across each aisle in order to support comprehensive reform. And I've had, because of my affiliations with these larger national organizations, I've actually had a seat at the table on some of those discussions. And so I think incremental reform will be the way for the next few years. On the hemp side, as soon as that's decoupled and the fiber and grain side is embraced, you're going to really see things take off. Right now in 2021, we estimated that there was 235,000 acres of licensed capacity for cultivation in the United States, 235,000 acres. By 2030, with the increase for grains, with the increase of fiber, I'm forecasting closer to 10 million acres. So not 235,000 acres, but 10 million acres. And so this is where we need the regulators and policymakers at the federal level to catch up with the visions that are occurring at the entrepreneurial level in the hemp space, because right now there's a lot of passion in the space for hemp. There's a lot of innovation and technological advancement, but it's just not being supported at the federal level. And once that alignment comes, then great things will occur for the hemp industry.
Definitely. I think that there's so much room for this industry to grow, and I think once we kind of get over those hurdles, I really feel like this industry has so much potential for the future, and for kind of changing the way that we've always done things, and for giving us a little bit of a push into new manufacturing processes and new ideas about the way products can and should be produced. So I'm definitely looking forward to the future. How can our listeners get in touch with you? What kind of services does Whitney Economics offer? Or, how can we tell people where they can go and get more information from Whitney Economics?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I have my website at whitneyeconomics.com, and we have a hemp area as well as a higher THC adult use and medical area. We can also run through iHemp manufacturing. Tony's done a tremendous job in terms of advocating for the industry as well. whitneyeconomics.com. Now, what we do is we provide reports, market entry strategies, pricing, forecasting. I even do expert witness testimony in trials. So if there's ever a legal conflict, they bring in the experts, and that's typically me. And then I also provide educational materials to policymakers and policy analysis and the like. I think if I were to close, and thanks for the opportunity today, I would mention the fact that recently that survey report was quoted in the newspaper in Thailand, and it was reported on in India and in South America and in Africa. And what it's in a way, of course, it's tooting my horn, but in another way, it's demonstrating the fact that cannabis, either hemp, adult use, or medical, is a global marketplace. And unless the U.S. market comes together and sorts out all of these issues and develops a federal policy, they may lose their competitive advantage on the international marketplace. I have inquiries all the time from clients around the world looking at how to operate in this system. And when other countries have a more unified federal system, and the U.S. is still trying to figure out the difference between CBD, fiber, and grain, or figuring out the difference between what is marijuana and what is hemp, it just, the more time that goes by, the less competitive the U.S. market will be. And so whenever I've talked before folks in these speeches and these various educational forums, I always say that it's important to think globally while acting locally, because it's a local issue. You've got local politicians and like, but you have to be mindful of the international competition that's out there, and it was ever present today when, from the Phuket Times, I'm being quoted, people are very much aware of what's going on in the U.S. from an adult use, medical, and industrial cannabis perspective.
It's definitely fascinating, and I am so thrilled to have you a part of this podcast and providing some of that inside information on really what's happening in the world of economics in cannabis. So thank you again for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks again for this opportunity.
Yes, and we certainly hope that people will take the time to visit your website, whitneyeconomics.com. We'd like to thank cannabistech.com, my co-host, Christina Etter. And thank you for being our featured guest on this episode, Mr. Whitney. And we hope that everybody will join us next month, where we get to speak with Ian Seed from the governor's office in Colorado and talk about everything hemp that's being developed on the ground in Colorado the same month, right before both Beau and I present at NOCO.